Okay, let's start with a simple, here's Shakespeare. How do we know anything about him at all? How do you know this guy existed? Because your teacher said so? What do you guys think? How do we know anything about him? Seriously? We have no thoughts in our heads today. I don't know why I can't switch these screens. It's really annoying. Nobody has any idea. How do you know? Maybe we just made it all up then. Maybe the teachers have been lying your whole life. Thank you. Yes. So whatever kind of public records might exist, okay, and trust me, there aren't many. So I'm going to switch here. Okay, we've got church records. So we've got recordings of like baptism, weddings, births of children for their baptisms. We've got if they had the actual last rites administered with the church, that we would know roughly when they died. And then obviously churches keep records of deaths, and they've got that recorded in their logs as well. Then we also have city records. And again, not much. Imagine what somebody would find out about you 400 years from now if they tried to find out what you were all about just with this information. Like if you belong to a church, or there's any kind of records of you in your religious organization. I mean, do they really know much about you, knowing that you were confirmed when you were a junior in high school, or whatever the equivalent is in your church, right? For the city records, we've got marriage license, we've got trials. In Shakespeare's case, he also had a coat of arms that he applied for his family. So the coat of arms itself reveals a little bit about the history of the family based on the design of it. But this is not a lot, right? There aren't any autobiographies. He didn't keep a journal. There's no personal kinds of writings that he wrote other than his actual like plays and poems, which might rely on, you need something to write with? Oh, okay. So there really isn't much, okay? So to a large degree, there's a lot of speculation about who he was. Did he actually even write his own works? Is this the right guy? There's a lot of speculation about who he was and what do we actually know about him. So from what we do have, he did give us some pretty juicy tidbits. All right, going into Shakespeare's life, we know that he was born in a place called Stratford-on-Avon on April 23rd, 1564, right? The on-Avon part means it's on a river, and the river's name is Avon, so that's the name of his town. Born on April 23rd, 1564, died on April 23rd, 1616. Which historians might think is kind of cool to say he died on his birthday. However, we don't really know that for sure. All we know, we do know exactly when he died. We don't know exactly when he was born. So they have baptismal records that show when he was baptized. And at that time, they would have not passed over a Sunday within his church without having a baby baptized. So there's a possibility of about 5 days that he could have been born. But because it sounds cooler to say that he died on his birthday, then they go with that. And if you read Julius Caesar, you might remember the part where Cassius is walking into the battle at the very end, and he's freaking out about the fact that he's walking into battle on his birthday and how he might actually die on the same day that he came into the world. Obviously, Shakespeare couldn't have known that he was going to die on his birthday because it wasn't suicide, it wasn't planned. But there is some kind of irony there, I guess, real life irony that happened. The fact that he actually died on his birthday, if he did and die on his birthday. Other things we know is that he probably attended the local grammar school until about age 15, because that's what people did back then. There's no record of his attendance at any kind of a university, so we don't have any documentation that he went any further than age 15. And to think that he is arguably the most prolific and most well-renowned writer of all time, that's pretty impressive. Right? There's no master's degree for him. He went till he was 15. And when you think about it, he was in somebody's English class, right? Can you imagine having this kid in your class? He definitely was a talent beyond anything else that anybody had ever seen. Dad was a bailiff, which is just kind of a fancy word for mayor. So we know that, again, because of town records. Other than that, we don't really know a whole lot. Getting into money, his mom had a lot of money. We know that because of inheritance stuff and sale of land that happened. So we know that his mom came from a pretty wealthy background. The groundlings that came to his plays, those are the people that literally sat on the ground right in front of the stage. They paid about a penny to come and see a play. So he really wasn't pulling in a lot of money in his actual delivery of his plays, at least not from the groundlings. The people who paid the most amount of money were the people actually that sat up in the balcony area, because Shakespeare's plays were presented in the round, which means that it was an open theater. So it was open to all of the elements. If it rained, they got wet, right? So the groundlings sitting in front of the stage paid less because they were exposed to the elements. If it was super hot, they didn't have any cover. So think of it kind of like a baseball game, where you go to the baseball stadium and the people that are right behind home plate might have a great view, but the people sitting in the box, they're getting like the good food, the good drinks, and if it rains, they're covered, and if it's super, super cold, they've got heat, right? So it's more like a box kind of scenario, in the sense that the people in the galleries up high paid the most amount of money to come see, because they had shelter when they were watching. It also then presented some challenges to be able to project your voice into the balconies to make it a quality experience for those people who are sitting far away. Unlike today, if we ever get back to concerts, people typically want to be down on the floor right in front of the stage, because then you're more likely to, like, I don't know, have them spit on you or whatever. People like that. They want to be close enough to the stage that they feel like they're a part of it all. That was not the case at all for Shakespeare's audience. That wasn't considered a glamorous place to be, right down in front. All right, so Shakespeare earned the equivalent in modern money of about $40 for writing a play, and which is really a pretty like slow night of waiting tables for those of you who are in the restaurant industry. So imagine writing Romeo and Juliet. Here's your 40 bucks. Thanks. Why would he continue to do this? Why would he spend an evening, or spend however long it took him to write Romeo and Juliet, and only get 40 bucks for it? Anybody? It's really kind of why our music industry is hurting so much right now, when you think about it, because of the pandemic. They're not making the usual amount of money because they're not touring. They're not pulling in all of the money from the ticket sales. So for a recording artist, recording is just a ticket to going on tour and making money. Let's face it, most people download illegally and steal that album anyway, or they're just getting it on their Spotify or whatever. They're not making a lot of money anymore on their actual recordings in terms of actual record sales, but they are making money when people come and pay. I don't know, how much have you guys paid for concerts? I know you haven't been able to go in a year, but what's the most anybody's paid for a concert in here? 200 bucks? Who'd you see? Okay. All right. Maybe a little bit more value there, right? Anybody else? Yeah. 300 for what? Yeah, for who was it? Harry Styles. Okay. All right. Anybody else? Yeah? Yeah? Who'd you see? Wow. Wow. So compare that to the album, which I don't even know what a CD costs anymore, because everybody just downloads it digitally. Is like 20 bucks for a CD. Do they even call them CDs anymore? What do they call them now that they're just digital? An album, which is funny because it's definitely not a vinyl album. Do they still call them albums? Anyway, for the digital download of those tracks of their new stuff, maybe 20 bucks. But if you're going to pay $100 to $300 to go see him, that's where the money is, right? So that's why musical recording artists are really hurting right now, because they haven't been able to go on tour for an entire year, right? So you better be saving your money, because once they can go, you know they're going to be coming out hard. They got to make some money, right? So Shakespeare, same thing. He wasn't really looking at making money for the actual physical plays that he was writing. He was generating material to be able to put on a play, to be able to charge admission. So even though the groundlings didn't pay much to go, they were kind of freebies, the people up in the galleries really did. And that's how he got his money. There was also a period of time when he was a paid actor, when he worked for King James, and he was the official entertainer, I guess, for the king. So there were patrons as well that donated to the arts, just like there are today. But the main money that he earned was from the actual ticket sales or admission price of attending. All right, Shakespeare and Love. If you haven't seen this movie, it actually is really good. I know it's old. It won Best Picture when it came out like a million years ago. Not a million. I think it was like late 90s maybe when it came out. So before your time, but definitely not black and white. There's a lot of speculation because we just don't have much to go on. And so people like to fill in the blanks in a creative kind of way. And so this first one, is this switching for you, Zoomers, or does it just say Shakespeare? Because my one screen just says Shakespeare. Are you alive, Zoomers? Anybody there?
Yeah, it's fine. It's changing.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right, good. Okay, so he applies for a marriage license to marry Anne Whately on November 27th, 1582. That's standard procedure even today. Before you get married, you have to apply for a license and have that all in place before you can actually get married. But then he married Anne Hathaway November 28th, 1582. So the question becomes, like, really, Whately to Hathaway, are they that terrible at writing things down or at spelling? Or are we talking about two different people? It seems logical that it's probably the same person, unless it's a last-ditch effort to try to marry somebody different because he didn't want to marry Anne Whately. I'm not really sure. But there's only one marriage license, and it was for Anne Whately. He only married one person. It was Anne Hathaway the next day. But to kind of add to the mystery, Susanna is born to the newlyweds on May 26th, 1583. So just let that sink in for a second. Anybody doing the math? We're not doing the math. It's too hard. It's 6 months, right? And so even today, I have a niece who's, I think, 26. When she was born, she was 1 pound, 12 ounces. She was born at 26 weeks, right? And I'm telling you, it was millions of dollars in medical bills that the insurance paid. But that was, what, like 1995, that they were able to keep her alive with all kinds of crazy medical advancements. 400 years ago, with some boiled water and some unsanitized rags, not going to happen at 6 months. Susanna is a healthy, robust, full-term baby when she enters the world. So absolutely, we had a situation where these two were forced into getting married, okay? She was pregnant. There was no getting out of it for him in the social situation that they were in. His hand was forced. So Susanna was born in May of 1583, and then they had twins, Judith and Hamnet, that were born 1585. Those were probably a lot of the inspiration for a lot of the twin humor that Shakespeare has throughout his plays. So many of his comedies have twins in them, and a lot of times they're boy-girl twins, which makes sense because that's what he had. Sadly, Hamnet dies in 1596 at the age of 11, which means that's the end of the Shakespeare line. It's definitely the end of the Shakespeare name. The line died out after that point, but the end of the name was a pretty significant deal to Shakespeare because it meant that nobody would carry on his name, and as a writer, he really had this sense of like wanting to live forever, which we'll get into in just a bit. Kind of obsessed with the idea of his legacy and would people remember him. So once his son died, it really turned into kind of a dark period in his life, which is understandable, but his works also turned dark. He went from writing his comedies into writing more of his dark and really his greater pieces. We're going to read a comedy in here, but I know that you guys have read some tragedies, yes? Yeah. Anybody new to Shakespeare completely with this round? You've all had some exposure? Yeah? Okay. All right, here we go. So then we go into this Elizabethan period. If you look at Queen Elizabeth, she's not known for her great looks. I'm just going to put that out there. You know, really like the style, the fashion didn't do her any favors either with that great big dog collar kind of thing. But her hairdo with the hairline that she has, I know it sounds terrible to pick on her like this, but there's significance to it. She was named the Virgin Queen because presumably, well, we know for sure she never married. The presumption is that being a good Christian girl, she would also then be a virgin. I have no idea because we don't document that sort of thing. But she was called the Virgin Queen because she never married. And so this is the time period in which Shakespeare wrote, and it was called either the Renaissance or the Elizabethan period. And the significance of the fact that she never married was, you know, you think about what our country just went through with an election and how much angst there was not knowing who was going to be president. I mean, it carried on longer than ever this time around because of the, you know, contesting the election, all that stuff. But now I feel like most people are kind of settled in and like it doesn't seem quite so dramatic anymore. We know who the president is. If we don't like who the president is, we know that in another 4 years we get to vote again, right? So it does seem like Americans are kind of resigned to the idea that I lost this one or I won this one, and you know, it's not forever. Okay, that's the thing in America. It's not forever. In England, it's for as long as she lives. She's queen, and unless somebody takes her out, like not like well, I guess marry her as well. But unless something happens to her, she remains queen. And we don't know how long that's going to last. She could get the plague and be dead tomorrow, or she could live as long as this queen is living, 100 years. We don't know. It really made people very, very, very uncomfortable because they didn't know if they were entirely secure. Okay, there was a lot of fighting between the Protestants and the Catholics, and am I on the right side, and is this going to work? And so there was even though the country was prospering, they also didn't know if it was going to end at any particular moment. There were threats from Mary Queen of Scots at the same time, you know, the possible takeover from her end, aligned with France. So there was a lot of just kind of uncertainty, and the fact that she didn't have an heir made it even more so because they couldn't visualize what was going to happen if something happened to her. How is that going to impact their life? Were they suddenly then going to be controlled by possibly a Catholic regime where the Protestants would be persecuted? And so even though things were going well economically, there was a lot of uncertainty in England during her reign because they didn't know what was going to happen when she died. All right, so that takes us then into a peaceful transfer of power, actually. Her nephew, James, became king. And at this point, Shakespeare gets a pretty sweet job being what's known as the King's Men. He and his players became the King's Men, and they performed specifically for the king. And that's when he wrote a lot of his history plays, because the king liked to see plays about kings because he was king, right? And eventually he became successful enough that he built his own theater called the Globe Theater. It doesn't exist anymore as it was, but it has been rebuilt in England. So if you watched the video yesterday, or if you still have to watch it tonight, they talk about the big fire that burned it down. during a performance of Henry VIII. And then when they rebuilt the theater, they built it on the other side of the Thames River. And that's when Shakespeare retired and decided not to continue with it all. Okay, so this is a replica of what it actually looked like at the time. All right, then we had 6 skills for acting, which are quite different than maybe what we have today for actors. And that's really because of the logistics of the time. So the first one was tumbling. Anybody in the musicals here, in the plays? Anybody involved with our theater department in the school? No? Nobody's in theater in here? Wow, that's crazy. Okay, let's think back. Have you ever been in a play of any sort where they gave you a script? Searching back in your mind, maybe even 5th grade, yeah, you know what I'm talking about, right? You get a script. Well, for Shakespeare, the requirements were pretty different. Tumbling doesn't seem like something that normally we would be asking our actors to do. I mean, it makes sense if you're trying out for the cheer team, that you'd have to be able to have that back tucked down or whatever. For Shakespeare, it was important because they were completely exposed when they were in the theater in the round. They didn't have any backdrops. They didn't have any curtains or anything to hide their entrances and their exits. And so tumbling became important for like a quick, unexpected kind of disappearance on stage. They actually had a trap door in the stage so that when you think back, if you read Macbeth, when the witches would appear and then they would disappear, there's a lot of ghosts in Shakespeare. There's the ghost of Julius Caesar appears in the end of Julius Caesar. Macbeth is full of ghosts. Hamlet's got ghosts in it. And so in order for them to have a logical, here's a ghost appearing or disappearing type entrance and exit, they had a trap door in the floor. And so they would have like a poof of smoke. They could create that to disguise somebody either supposedly vaporizing if they were a mist of some kind of a spirit or something. But really, they would just be tumbling down the trap door. Okay? The next one, elocution, is basically kind of a fancy way for saying speaking loudly and clearly for other people to hear you. And this was really important because, again, we talked about those people sitting in the galleries way up high. If they can't hear, imagine going to a concert and you can't hear the person singing on the stage. Like, how much are you going to pay for those tickets up in the gallery if you can't hear the music, right? That's pretty much a deal breaker, I would think, that you'd say, no, thank you, I'm not going to pay for that. And they didn't have any electricity. So, and they weren't using megaphones because that would seem, can you imagine Romeo and Juliet with megaphones with their sweet, you know, I'm so hot for you kind of lines that they were saying, right? They've got to still have the appearance of being normal people that are speaking to each other, but they have to do it in a way that everybody can hear them and that it's believable and that it's good enough then that they're like, yeah, I want to come back and see it again. I'm going to tell my friends about this. It was so awesome. Now, granted, they'd never experienced our standards, so maybe they were willing to deal with a little bit of like shouting kind of thing for the sake of that's the way it's done. But they had to be pretty good at doing that without blowing the cover of who they were, right? In terms of being an actor on stage. You can't just be shouting your lines. All right, acting seems redundant, and I realize it is a little bit, but the reason I want to talk about that is we talked about the script just a second ago. Imagine a time with no photocopiers. They can't just print off a script for everybody in the play, right? So Shakespeare writes one, he shares it with the main guys, they memorize their lines as fast as they can, and then they might have somebody who is literally taking it around to the lower level characters, and some of those lower level characters have multiple parts because he's got to keep his acting troupe small enough that he can afford to pay them, so he doubles people up. And so the people that are taking those lower parts, especially the parts of like the young boy kind of thing, those are the outcast people in society. Shakespeare's theater was not considered highbrow at all. Like now people like think it's kind of snooty, kind of like high class to go see a Shakespeare play. In Shakespeare's own time, it was kind of like going to the Vegas Strip, right? It was not considered highbrow at all. In fact, they kept getting shut down because they were so scandalous. And so the people that took jobs as actors in Shakespeare's time were pretty much like castaways in life. A 13-year-old boy, who's not going to let their kid do that? That kid's a runaway. That kid's an orphan, right? And he hasn't had the benefit of Elmbrook schools and having a Chromebook and a teacher who cares about his learning. He probably can't read. He may never have gone to school at all. And so now you're talking about people who can't read. Somebody's got to read the script to them. Then they've got to memorize and remember what those lines are so that the next kid can learn his lines, right? And this is all happening at a really fast pace where they're rolling out a new play every week or two, and then they have to learn more new parts. Okay, so memorization was huge. They didn't have a physical script of their own. They may have had to have somebody read the lines to them and just remember what they were. And then you add in the fact that women can't be performing on stage. So all those really awesome female parts, like Juliet or Lady Macbeth, that was really a dude dressed up like a woman, right? And so now you've got to make us rip our hearts out at the end of Romeo and Juliet, and it's really two dudes, right? Which is fine, except they're not supposed to be two dudes. It's supposed to be a guy and a girl. And so the dude playing Juliet's got to be convincing. He's got to actually look the part and act the part of a girl. So I would say that takes some acting skill, right? Beyond maybe what we would see today. All right, dancing. Again, we wouldn't really normally think unless it's a musical, but Shakespeare's plays are not musicals. It was important because Shakespeare thought that his audience was too immature, too unsophisticated to really handle the idea that somebody died at the end of the play, a tragedy. That if that happened, he thought he would turn them off to theater and they would never come back. If Romeo and Juliet were really dead, they'd be like, oh my gosh, why would I ever do that again? That's like going and watching a train crash. Like, I can't go through that again. It's too emotional. So at the end of every play, even the tragedies, there was a great big dancing musical number where they brought back all those dead characters to make everybody feel good and happy before they left the theater to ensure that they would come back again. So it kind of blows it. You know, if you've watched the end of Romeo and Juliet and you're like, you knew it was coming, but you still just feel terrible in the end. But then they come back on stage. Oh, no, just kidding. We're really okay. Everything's happy and happily ever after, right? So dancing, important skill. Fencing, we got a lot of fencing scenes in Shakespeare. That's kind of their way of fighting, hand-to-hand combat, no guns. And so you had to be good enough at it that you could look realistic and not make it look like, oh, that's so fake. Well, it's always fake on stage, folks. That's the whole point, right? Like when you go see a movie and they've got some kind of a fight scene, that's all fake. It's all staged. But it's the moment that it is obvious to us that it's fake, we go, ugh, that's so fake, right? We want to believe. It's called a suspension of disbelief, right? When we go and sit down in a movie theater for 2 hours, we're saying, you've got my mind, take me on a journey, and I'm going to believe it. And the moment that they cross that line and it's no longer believable, you get annoyed. But really, you knew from the start it wasn't going to be real. It's all just fake. But it kind of breaks the spell, okay? You're kind of sitting there under a magical spell when you watch a movie where you're just taking it all in and believing it for the moment that it's happening, okay? So for the fencing scene, they can't be super fake about it because if it's fake, people are gonna like, ugh, that's so fake, right? But if they're so good that they're really good at it and they actually kill the person, well, then they just killed the guy they're supposed to do the play with the next night, and that's not gonna work either, right? So they've gotta be good enough that they're convincing, but also to the point where they don't hurt the person. All right, and then finally a musical instrument. You can't just plug your aux cord in with your iPhone for the theater and blast the tunes at the end. You had to actually have some music for that dancing number, and so they had to produce their own. Everybody had to play some kind of musical instrument. And again, there's no private lessons at White House of music, right? You haven't been taking lessons since 5th grade with your class. Your parents haven't invested and finally bought you that violin. These are scrappy runaway type people. So they had to pick it up and learn it on their own without any great instruction. Okay, so now let's talk about a day at the Globe. All right, we talked about the groundlings. So those are the people that sit down on the floor. They might have their picnic baskets, their goats, whatever. Okay, it's kind of a chaotic, almost festival type atmosphere on the ground. The galleries, those are the people that paid more, that sat up high and had some cover. The significance here is that all of these plays are performed at noon or like midday because they didn't have any lights, right? And so the reason that it's important to talk about that is that in Shakespeare's plays, he often writes in aspects about the weather or the time of day, and the characters will talk about it because there was no way to signal it with lighting or with sound effects because there weren't any, right? So when we're having a horrible, terrible storm in Julius Caesar, that's just, we got to talk about that because there's no way to show it. If it really were a terrible storm, they'd have to call the show off, right? And so there's a lot of mention of the weather and the time of day. Okay, for his types of plays, he's got 3 different kinds. He's got comedy, history, and tragedy. He wrote 37 in total. And some examples that you might have heard of for comedy, obviously, there's like Taming of the Shrew. We're going to read Much Ado About Nothing in here. Some other famous ones are A Midsummer Night's Dream, Twelfth Night, Comedy of Errors. I'm trying to think what else comes to my head right now. Those are kind of the big ones that stand out to me. History plays are always named after an actual king. Okay, it's just his name, Henry V, probably the most famous history play. There's a whole bunch of Richard I, I think Richard II, Richard III. There's Henry IV Part 1 and Henry IV Part 2. They're pretty straightforward. It's the history of Henry V kind of thing. The tragedies are really considered his greatest works. So the ones that are probably most familiar to you are Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Julius Caesar, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth. Those are the ones that are considered the most, there's the most depth, I guess, of feeling, of emotion, of character development, of theme that are happening in those. They capture the human condition, the range of emotions, the angst of the human condition, I guess. When people wonder, like, why do people read him? It's been 400 years and there's been so much written since then. Not all of them are still read as often as some of the big ones, right? So it's not like all 37 are still box office hits. But there definitely is something to these, and they have also influenced so many works that have come since then. J.K. Rowling pulls on Shakespeare all over the place. They are just so influential in so many other writers that you can follow the trail almost always back to Shakespeare. All right, so there are some requirements of a tragedy. We're not reading a tragedy this time, but these are the requirements. The hero must die, the hero has to be flawed, and the hero never reaches his goal. So the hero's got to be flawed means that in whatever way that he's flawed, that's going to lead to his downfall, to his death. So Romeo, he was a hothead, okay? He should not ever have gotten mixed up with Juliet's cousin in the street, okay? He knew it was a bad idea. He was trying to keep the peace, but when his friend, is it Mercutio? There's Mercutio and Tybalt. Mercutio is his friend, and he gets killed by Tybalt, and then Romeo freaks out and has to avenge his friend's death, kills Juliet's cousin, creates a huge problem, right? Okay, so the hero is never just going to get hit by a bus, okay? He's not going to get diagnosed with cancer, some rare form that has nothing to do with anything that he's done in his life, like lung cancer because he smoked, right? It's never going to be like that. He is going to die because of something stupid that he did earlier in the play. Some kind of character flaw that leads to his end. All right, the hero never reaches his goal. So Romeo and Juliet never going to live happily ever after. Hamlet's never going to avenge his father's death and become king himself. Macbeth, if you read that one, you know that doesn't end well. Yes, he does become King of Scotland, but he also ends up with his head on a pike. So it's never going to be a happy ending with a tragedy. Oh, that's funny. Somebody wrote on this slide, I write. That's funny. Somebody must have written that on the smartboard and I saved it. Huh, okay. So the types of verse, most of the plays are written in what's called blank verse. And then there is something called iambic pentameter, okay? Now, the reason we're talking about this is really to just give you some kind of an insight into his genius, okay? An iambic pentameter is a 10-beat line with 5 sets of syllables in an unstressed, stressed pattern. So basically, it goes like this. Ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. Next line. Ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. Next line. Throughout the entire 30 pages of the play, okay? That's the deal. He very rarely will alter that. Occasionally, he'll do it intentionally, like with the witches in Macbeth. They spoke in shorter lines than the full 10-beat line. But most of his plays are written in iambic pentameter. Only a small amount are written in prose, and that's when you look at the script and it looks like a paragraph instead of a jagged line on the end. And so when I put the plays in your hand, you'll see it looks different when somebody's speaking in iambic pentameter versus when they're speaking in prose. And the reason that's important is because it's incredibly hard to write in iambic pentameter. Okay, his sonnets, I think they're 14 lines, I believe. It's really hard to write a sonnet and have it mean anything and be insightful and stick to that 10-beat line and the rhyme scheme and still have it say what you want it to say in the end. Most people end up compromising just for the sake of, well, this will fit, this will work, right? If they try to write one. Well, he wrote entire plays like this, which means he had an incredible control over the written language in terms of rhyme scheme and syllables. He was really like an inspiration when you think about just like modern day rapping, okay? That consistent beat, that consistent pattern. Oh, my thing is dying. Hold on, let me plug this in. Right, so that consistent beat and pattern is pretty impressive to stick with that. What can I unplug? Hold on 1 second. There we go. Being able to stick with that consistently is just nothing short of genius. It's really an incredible feat to be able to do that. The people who speak in prose, the paragraph style, it's either Shakespeare saying this is a low-level, uneducated person, or he's showing that he doesn't agree with what that person is saying. He's kind of casting judgment on them based on the style that he has them speak. Okay, for retirement. Shakespeare returned to Stratford after his theater burned down. He goes back to Stratford, which was about 70 miles from where he had been performing in London. And presumably his family stayed behind in London. Okay, and so there's all kinds of speculation. And if you've watched the video, they get into it pretty intensely with that video, I think. There's all kinds of speculation that it wasn't a marriage of love. He makes all kinds of references throughout his plays about not marrying an older woman, and his wife, I think, was 8 years older than he was, 6 or 8 years older than he was. So he's really kind of casting judgment, it's hard not to look at that as a personal statement when he's married to an older woman himself. And he's got 70 miles between him and his wife. There was no public transportation at that time. To get to his wife, it was a full day ride on a horse. Right? And so if he goes home one day, he's got to have another day to come back. If he's performing on the weekends, he doesn't really have the margin to take 2 days for travel and spend any kind of significant time with his wife and family before he has to get back and actually perform on the weekends. So it's likely he went long stretches of time not being with his family. Does that mean he doesn't love his wife? I don't know. I mean, there's all kinds of speculation that maybe he was a homosexual. He was married. He obviously got his wife pregnant before they actually got married. So he, at best, not best, I don't know how to phrase that. He was He was for sure bisexual if he's a homosexual, okay? Because he did have a relationship with his wife that produced 3 children, right? Whether or not he was also bisexual, hard to say for sure. The reason that they kind of get into that in the video is because he did write poems that were written about a man. The question becomes, did he write them coming from his own heart for a man, or did he write them for a patron that we know he had a patron who was paying him money to support his art? That man was known to be a homosexual. So it's quite possible he wrote these poems for his patron to give to a man, or maybe he just wrote them himself to give to a man. I don't know for sure. I would ask you, the last time you bought a Hallmark card, right? Valentine's Day maybe. Do you know the gender of the person who wrote that card? I would argue that women probably write some pretty decent Valentine's Day cards coming to a woman. And men probably write some decent ones for men. I don't think anybody cares who wrote it. You just want the sentiment to match whatever it is that you want to say to the person you're giving it to, right? And so I do think it's a little bit questionable whether or not he actually felt what he was writing in those sonnets, or if he was just doing it for hire. I don't know that it matters to anybody anyway, but they do kind of speculate on that in the video, so I thought I'd bring it up. Okay, so he returns to Stratford. He names his new house is called New Place. I have never been able to get to the bottom of whether or not he named it that or if it was named that before he bought it. Seems like a very unoriginal name for the greatest writer of all time to name his house. But it's called New Place. Shakespeare was terrified of death. So what he did was he wrote his own epitaph. And the epitaph is what goes on the actual gravestone. Okay? So Shakespeare knew that noble people were buried underneath the floorboards of the church. If you've ever been to Europe, if you walk through a Catholic church, as you walk down the center aisle, every 6 feet you're walking over the top of a plate of a gravestone that somebody has been buried underneath the floorboards of the church. And the reason they did it was because they knew that people would be going up for communion and they would be walking over that little aisle or hallway area, and then they would be constantly reminded of that person who had passed away. It's totally opposite of the way we look at things in America, where we say, you know, you're not supposed to walk on top of a grave in the cemetery. You're supposed to like stick to the paths and not walk on top of the grave. In England, that was like a thing of honor for people to be walking over the top of that grave every time that they went up for communion. Sometimes people went daily to Mass and then went up for communion every day, and they'd be reminded of that person. So Shakespeare knew that he would be buried in the church. He had enough fame, enough status in his town near the end of his life that he knew he'd be buried in the church. But he was also really freaked out about the idea that what happens when the church gets all filled up and all of the spots are taken and somebody else super famous dies and they need the space. Okay, and so thinking back, if you've ever seen that iconic image of Shakespearean actors holding a skull, does that ring any bells for you? Like the classic holding a skull, looking at a skull kind of thing? No? Do you know what I'm talking about? It's kind of an iconic Shakespearean symbol. It's from Hamlet, and the scene in Hamlet, he finds the skull of his court jester who used to play with him when he was a child, and so people who were not super important, their bones were thrown into what was called a charnel house, kind of like an outhouse where they threw bones. So he finds the skull of the person who used to play with him as a child, and he totally freaks out. Okay, it's the start of his to be or not to be speech, when he's contemplating suicide and wondering what the value of life is as he's looking at the skull. Well, that's in his mind. He wrote that scene, right? He's freaked out about the idea of his own bones being thrown into a charnel house someday and somebody else picking up his skull and saying, oh, wow, this is that old Shakespeare guy, right? So he was terrified that they would dig him up and something would happen to his bones. So he cursed his own grave, right? It's not really unusual for somebody to write their own epitaph, to have their whole burial planned out. If you watch any kind of late night TV, you'll see commercials, because apparently old people can't sleep. And so they see commercials like that and think they've got to start planning their funeral. So it's pretty common for people to have a plan. Okay, they know where their plot is, they know what the tombstone is. The craziest story I've ever heard about it was my great aunt when I was really little. Her husband passed away, and I remember going to the cemetery with my mom, seeing all the relatives, their gravestones, and my aunt, who was still alive, had a headstone in the cemetery. Her name was already on it. It had her birth date, the year, and then a dash, and then a 19. And they were literally just waiting for her to die to fill in the last 2 digits. And I thought it was truly the most morbid thing I'd ever seen in my life, right? Like, I do not want to see, that's just me. I don't want to see my gravestone before I die. I don't want to visualize that. I don't want my name and my dates etched into stone somewhere before I even die, right? Ironically, she lived to 2001, and so they had to etch out the 19 anyway. They never expected her to live that long, so she kind of got them in the end. But the point is, people plan out their gravestones. They don't put a curse on them. That's the part that is super crazy. Okay, so the next one here, and this is technically what it says on his gravestone, even though the spellings are kind of crazy. And Shakespeare clearly knew how to spell, because this is not the way he spells in his plays. So the best way I can explain it is that it's kind of like, just like a stylistic, almost calligraphy kind of thing. That would be a fancier way of spelling, I guess. But this is what he wrote. Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he who moves my bones. So basically, dig me up and I'm going to come back and curse you. That's what he wanted on his gravestone, right? And so he is buried in Trinity Church in Stratford. He's not actually underneath the floorboards. He's, if you look on this slide, he's kind of over here left to the altar. I know this image is kind of hard to see in the classroom, but he's got a raised platform grave that he's buried in. So he was so important that he wasn't even in the floorboards. He was in a raised grave, and I don't know how they keep it from stinking. Everybody always asks me that. I don't know. They had some kind of embalming something so that the bodies didn't start to stink in the church. But his grave is still there. He's got this plaque on the top of it that has his curse on it, and nobody's ever touched it. And so the speculation as to why would he possibly curse his grave? Well, he didn't want to be moved. A lot of other people speculate maybe he's got some kind of personal writings that he had buried with him, that he also left instructions that he didn't want the world to have, that he literally wanted to take with him to his grave. But they've never dug him up, and so we wouldn't know. And probably anything that was in there now would just be disintegrated anyway, because it's been so long. So that is the deal with Shakespeare. Anybody have any questions? How many of you have watched the video already? A bunch of you. Okay. All right. So fair game, anything on this PowerPoint and also on the video that you had for yesterday. Quiz tomorrow, and then we're going to start watching Much Ado About Nothing. Not watching. We're going to read it. We're going to read an act and then watch an act through all 5 of them. Okay, so I think it'll help once we read one act to watch it. You'll have the characters in your head. It'll make it easier to follow along, and not that it's a difficult play to understand, but I think it helps to visualize the characters as we read. All right, so Zoomers, I do have hard copies that I just photocopied, but I put everything on the Week at a Glance as well. So if you want a hard copy, shoot me an email and I'll leave one for you in the front lobby. But if you want to just print it out at home or just follow along digitally, that's fine too. And then I also have the study guide. So if you want to, the study guide's optional. If you want to do it, I'll give you some desperate credit for it. I do think it'll help you to follow along and to keep track of what's going on, but it's not required. Okay? All right, so I'm going to end the recording. Zoomers, shoot me an email if you want me to leave you either a play or a study guide or both. And then I'm going to hand out copies to all of you guys in here. And then you have the rest of the time. If you haven't watched the video yet, you can get started on it at least. I think it's about 45 minutes long. And you can always speed up the speed just a little bit if you feel like you need to do that. All right, so I'm going to end the recording.